Ich darf Sie alle nochmal herzlich willkommen heißen zur vierten und für dieses Jahr vorerst letzten Veranstaltung unserer Reihe Digitalisierung feministisch und dekolonial. Mein Name ist Francesca Schmidt und ich darf Sie heute Abend zusammen mit Hanna Lichtentäler durch den Abend führen. Und bevor ich unseren Gast heute vorstelle, über den ich mich sehr freue, Paola Ricorte-Cano, noch ganz kurz was zu Hanna und zu mir und zum Ablauf für den Abend. Hanna Lichtentäler studierte im Bachelor- und Master Nordamerika-Studien mit den Schwerpunkten Medien, Kultur und Gender in Berlin, England und Michigan und schloss mit ihrer Masterarbeit zum Thema Reimagining Feminism Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It, It is a Netflix Series ab. Vor dem Studium absolvierte sie eine zweijährige bilinguale Ausbildung zur Industriekauffrau in Madrid und sie arbeitet derzeit als Referentin für Medien und Digitales beim Kinderschutzbund Bundesverband. Sie ist außerdem Mitglied von Netzforma e.V., ein Verein für feministische Netzpolitik. Da war sie bis 2023 aktiv im Vorstand. Herzlich willkommen, Hanna. Schön, dass du heute nochmal meine Co-Moderatorin hier bist. Ich bin Referentin für intersektionales Erinnerungs- und Transformationswissen mit einem Schwerpunkt auf Digitalisierung in der Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung. Und im Bereich Digitalisierung und aus intersektional-feministischer Perspektive bin ich schon relativ lange unterwegs. Davor habe ich den Schwerpunkt feministische Netzpolitik, feministische Digitalpolitik im Gunnar-Werner-Institut für Feminismus und Geschlechterdemokratie in der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung aufgebaut und bin auch ein Gründungsmitglied von Netzforma e.V. Das soll es zu mir gewesen sein. Noch ganz kurz zum Format des heutigen Abends. Wir treffen uns wieder im Webinarformat. Das heißt, wir unterhalten uns hier oben. Sie können gerne Fragen stellen über die Fragen- und Antworten-Funktion, die Hanna dann clustern wird und aufs Podium bringen wird. Sie können aber auch gerne, wenn Sie lieber persönlich mit uns sprechen wollen, einfach die Hand heben und dann holen wir Sie hier aufs Podium und Sie können Ihre Frage hier stellen. Sie können die Frage auf Deutsch als auch auf Englisch stellen. Wir haben ja Übersetzung dabei. So, das so viel zum Housekeeping. Kommen wir also zu dem Teil, warum wir eigentlich überhaupt hier uns heute treffen. Die Reihe Digitalisierung, feministisch und dekolonial möchte machtkritische Perspektiven auf die digitale Transformation und Transformationsprozesse eröffnen und unter anderem danach fragen, was diese Transformationsprozesse für Auswirkungen vor allem auf marginalisierte Communities haben. Und wir möchten dann eben auch Digitalisierung als einen gesellschaftlichen Transformationsprozess verstehen. Und als solcher bedarf er nicht nur technischer und finanzieller Ressourcen in der Umsetzung, sondern vielmehr ist auch das Wissen um solche Veränderungsprozesse notwendig. Dieses Wissen ist in vielen Communities bereits vorhanden. Und damit wir dieses Wissen sozusagen auch in diese Prozesse einbinden, der Transformation, also Gesellschaft in ihrer Pluralität auch darstellen und einbinden, sind machtkritische Perspektiven unabdingbar. In dieser Reihe kommen also Expertinnen zur digitalen Transformation zu Wort und geben uns neue Perspektiven auf das Feld. Und im Sinne einer dekolonialen Praxis wird es vor allem auch darum gehen, Wissen, was bisher an den Rändern verortet war, zu zentrieren. Heute soll es eben um die Frage gehen, wie wir Daten dekolonisieren können und welche Veränderungen dieser Prozess mit sich bringt. Denn eins ist auch klar, Dekolonisierung ist gerade sozusagen ein Trend, der überall aufgerufen wird. Aber trotz allem müssen wir uns kritisch fragen und auch kritisch analysieren, was denn eigentlich eine Dekolonisierung von Daten und Technologie überhaupt bedeuten kann und auch bedeutet. Warum ist sie überhaupt notwendig? Was würde das alles beinhalten? Und davor sollten wir uns auch noch fragen, wie wirkt denn eigentlich die Kolonialität der Macht durch Daten und Technologien? Es sind viele Fragen, die wir heute diskutieren. Wir haben zum Glück eine uns ausgewiesene Expertin in diesem Feld, auf die ich mich besonders freue, Paola Ricorte-Cano gewinnen können. Sie Abteilung für Medien und digitale Kultur am Tecnológico de Monterrey und eine Fakultätsassoziierte im Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society an der Harvard University. Sie ist außerdem Mitbegründerin des Netzwerks Tierra Común. Das ist ein Netzwerk, das Aktivistinnen, BürgerInnen und WissenschaftlerInnen zusammenbringt, die auch genau diese Frage behandeln, wie können wir Daten dekolonisieren und welche schreiben. Außerdem die Leiterin des lateinamerikanischen und karibischen Hubs des feministischen KI-Forschungsnetzes. Soweit der Vorstellung. Ich freue mich jetzt besonders auf den Input und auf die Diskussion im Anschluss. Paola, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. I am really grateful for being here. Thank you very much, Francesca, for the invitation. I'm honored. I'm thankful for being here. Thank you, our wonderful interpreters. Interpretation is always hard. So I'm really grateful for your work, especially because I don't speak English very well. So you are translating like from, I think, in Spanish. I'll try to speak in English, and you're going to translate it in German. So this is how diversity works, right? We are trying to understand each other, even if we don't speak the same language. I will begin describing myself. I am a mestiza woman. I have curly hair, but today I'm wearing a headband. And I'm also wearing a traditional Mexican white blouse with colorful flowers, by hand by Mexican artisans. And I'm short, but fortunately you cannot see that because we're on Zoom. And before beginning, I would like to say that I have been working over the past years on different topics, but mainly about, I have been thinking around data, decoloniality, and also lately around feminist AI as part of this network that Francesca mentioned, Tierra Común, that is an initiative that comes from the interest of working beyond academia, working with communities, and also another project called Incubating Feminist AI, with the feminists that I have been working with, the Feminist AI Research Network. So I'm going to begin sharing my screen. Let's see. Right. So I entitled the talk, Decolonizing Data. And originally I was going to speak about the feminist decolonial imagination. I am going to speak about that, but then I changed the title, and I also include this subtitle called Decolonizing Bodies and Territories. So as I said, I belong to the Tierra Común network and also to the Feminist AI Research Network. Some of the things that I am going to talk about today are in these publications. They are in Spanish. But in these publications, I have been trying to develop this idea around data and decolonization, but also around decolonizing and depatriarchalizing technologies. So today I will be speaking about 4 topics. The first is coloniality. Probably you are aware about this, but just to remember what is coloniality. And then I will be speaking about datafication, then about data, bodies, and territories, and then what does it mean to decolonize when we speak about data. So first, coloniality. And I will begin with this quote from Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist, who said that coloniality is one. I'm not seeing my screen. Thank you. One of the constitutive and specific elements of the world pattern of capitalist power. It is based on the imposition of a racial, ethnic, and I added gender because he especially spoke about racialization, classification of the world population as a cornerstone of this pattern of power, and operates in each of the planes, spheres, and dimensions, material and subjective, of everyday social existence, and on a societal scale. So what I like from the decolonial framework is that it brings the reflection on the material and the immaterial. Not only when we speak about technology in particular, we tend to focus on the material aspects of technology, but this framework brings the idea of the material, the subjective relations, but also this idea of the creation of the idea of race as a form of legitimation of domination. So for Quijano, the coloniality of power means the control over, again, the material elements, but also the immaterial, the labor and its products, nature and its resources, sex, and I added body, subjectivity, intersubjective relations, knowledge, communication, and also systems of authority, institutions, and violence. So the coloniality of power is a matrix of power that controls, as I was mentioning before, every sphere of our social life, and also tries to control, of course, our environment, our resources, natural resources. So Quijano spoke about the coloniality of being, knowing, and sensing, trying to say that when we speak about coloniality, we are speaking about an ontological, an epistemic, and a sensitive order of society. So I was mentioning that for me, the decolonial framework is useful because, as Maldonado Torres says, it allows us to understand the nexus between knowledge, power, and being, which sustains an endless war against specific bodies, racialized bodies, gender bodies, disabled bodies, knowledge, cultures, peoples, and territories. And what I have been trying to do over the past years is to put together, to articulate the decolonial framework with the reflection, the critical reflection on datification. So I like to speak not only about data or technology, I like to speak about data assemblages, like a set of components that is more than one specific entity or device, for example. So for me, data assemblages amplify historical forms of colonization through a complex arrangement of materialities, territories, practices, bodies, and subjectivities. And this regime in which we live in, it's a regime of, it's a knowledge regime. So this regime based on data is what I call data epistemologies that are an expression of the coloniality of power, a violent imposition of ways of being, thinking, feeling, sensing, that leads to the expulsion of human beings from the social order, denies the existence of alternative worlds and epistemologies, and threatens lives on Earth. So usually we hear that data is raw, but from this point of view, from a critical point of view, data is never raw. Data is never neutral. Data is always political. Data is embodied. Data is situated. Data is material. Data is also relational. It allows various forms of relationship, but also embodies previous forms of relationship. So having covered this or reviewed this idea of what does the decolonial framework brings to the reflection on data and our data assemblages, I would like to speak a little bit about datification. And of course, probably you also have read a lot about datification as the process of converting our lives into data. But one thing that is important for me is that we have to think about our lives, our social lives that are being translated into data, but also we have to think about the datification of the ecosphere. Going back to the idea of the material and immaterial, the bodies and the territories that are involved in these processes of datification. The territory is a relevant side of that production. And of course, we know that from a historical point of view, that the colony brought this idea of extractivism at scale that is based on the idea of taking resources, but also taking knowledge from people and dispossessing people from their knowledge, their resources, their ways of living. And this, of course, is a violent process. And for some scholars from different parts of the world, datification is a continuation of this process of extractivism that began in the colony. It's a new form of extracting value from people, but also from the territories. And I brought here quote from a movement of defenders of the land in Mexico, indigenous land defenders, because the idea of extractivism and dispossession is very present, is part of their everyday struggles against the Mexican state, but also against the power of the cartels that are occupying the territories. So for these movements, the extractivist violence and dispossession that plague indigenous peoples and communities begin when their bodies are taken as someone else's property, controlled, beaten, mutilated, cursed, and murdered. And I read this quote because I think when we think of data, we don't think of data as a violent process of extraction and dispossession that is linked to this process of extractivism and violence that are actually experiencing people from, well, in this case, from Mexico, but from all over Latin America. So extractivism and dispossession are the dominant model of the data economy, of the datafied society. And the extractive logics or the extractive reason seeks to grab the spheres that are essential for sustaining life. So this means that extraction is not only extraction of, for example, we can say the things that we do, but it's more than that, is extracting our sensibilities, is extracting our own forms of existence. So datification mediates how we relate to ourselves, to others, and to the world. And datification is an epistemic regime. It's a way to construct orders of classification of peoples. And as we have been saying, datification is also a form of epistemic violence in the way that we actually are experiencing now. And epistemic violence is important because epistemic violence enables other forms of violence. So at the beginning of the colony, epistemic violence based on the racial difference was the way in which the colonizers legitimated the dispossession and the domination of the bodies and the territories of the inhabitants of Abya Yala, we call it, or Latin America. So datification generates social orders of classification, but these social orders of classification are global orders of classification of people and of the world that lead to economic, epistemic, social, cultural, and environmental inequality. So this epistemic process is legitimating, is facilitating, is habilitating other forms of violence, other forms of injustice, including epistemic injustice, but of course, social injustice, environmental injustice as well, and economic injustice. So datification affects all of us, but not all of us equally. And here I will bring the category of the body territory. That is a category that emerged from women's struggles in Central America and South America. Indigenous women, land defenders, use the category of the body territory as a continuum of their existence. And this unity of the body and territory is important in their worldview, because the relationship that they have with the territory is more than an occupation. It's a way to enable life. So when we speak about bodies and territories, we have to ask which bodies and which territories are bearing the cost of objectification. So we all know that extractivism, dispossession, control, and surveillance is focused on specific bodies and specific territories. And this is easy when we, for example, see the borders, which are the bodies that are surveilled, which are the bodies that are controlled. When, for example, we see children, when we see policies that are oriented towards controlling the bodies of women or other sexual and gender dissidents. So this process is affecting specific bodies and specific territories. So if we connect the extractivist process of the territories, like the traditional extractivism, with data extractivism, we can easily draw a line, because the extractivism of the territory is now habilitated also by the datafication of the ecosphere. And traditional extractivist industries are data industries as well, that are causing harm, health problems, displacing communities from their territories. And I began, as you remember, with the quotation from these indigenous movements, because their lands are being occupied, but these lands are being also surveilled by the state, by the criminal organizations. And the body, the community body, the communal body of the communities of these people is also being harmed. So we can also ask which bodies and which territories are producing data, which are the bodies and territories that are mining the data, which bodies and territories are labeling the data, or analyzing the data, owning the data, and governing the data. And we, of course, we can imagine, if we see a map, we can localize the bodies and the territories that are occupying these forms of labor, that are, again, reproducing a division of labor globally, but now based on this data regime. So who is able to analyze the data, and who is able to mine, to extract the data, and who is able to, and who has to label the data or clean the data. So again, we are reproducing these social orders of classification that I was mentioning before. So the last part is about decolonizing. So we said that, well, Francesca said that the decolonial framework is a trend. And for me, sometimes it's painful, because when we speak about the decolonial framework, at least for me, it's not only that it's a way, it's a tool to think about these issues, but for many of us, this is a political praxis. I mean, it's not a theory. If you want to decolonize something, you have to change something, you have to do something. And when we're speaking about data, I did this drawing. It's a way to explain that we are not speaking only about one specific phase of the or process of the data pipeline, because we speak a lot about the data pipeline, the extraction, and the collection, the processing of data, the storage, the consumption, the training of the algorithms. But we don't speak about the other processes that are around the production of data and the consumption of data. And for example, we of course now know that storing this data uses a lot of energy, a lot of water, that is probably leaving communities without these resources. So for me, it's important the connection between this body and territory that I was mentioning before, with the production and the consumption of data. So it's important for me to highlight that we are speaking about a whole system, a whole regime that is trying to, of course, as I said before, control the bodies, the subjectivities, our intersubjective relations, our labor, our natural resources, our territories, the forms of our authorities, our norms and laws, our infrastructures as well. So it's more than only data. It's a whole set of components. It's a regime that is trying to connect all these pieces, and of course, have something that makes possible the extraction and also the dispossession of specific bodies and territories. I put it like in this other way to see, like when we speak about the layers of the internet, and when we think about our own consumption and production of data, we usually think about the layer of the content and the application layer. For example, when we use social networks or when we, I don't know, browse the internet. But we probably don't think much about the other layers, the layers of the protocols, the layers of the storage of data, the antennas, the cables that are also part of this data assemblage. And when we speak about decolonizing data, for me, is taking action to try to change the asymmetries of power that are embedded in this whole system, in all these layers, and in all this connection of processes, practices, actors, institutions, subjectivities, ways of relating to each other. So we are speaking about knowledge systems, we are speaking about systems of authority, about our intersubjective relations, about infrastructures, about our bodies, territories, and the response that people from the territories and many movements, indigenous movements, but also feminist movements, is to say that if we want to decolonize something, we need to think about a collective process. It's not an individual thing, because again, it's a political praxis that tries to change these asymmetries that are reproduced through this data regime. So the solutions are always communal. They should be sustainable because again, this relationship between the body and the territory is unbreakable. And these are some examples that I brought from different collectives these are from Mexico, feminist servers. They maintain their own servers with their own data and also provide servers to other collectives. This example is from Fushiko. This is an intranet that is again maintained by a feminist collective in Brazil. And this is another example, going back to the idea of the feminist decolonial imagination, that feminists bring this idea of trying to imagine alternative futures, alternative technologies, alternative ways to relate to data through, for example, games. And this is a card game developed by Joanna Barón and Sasha Kostashchuk that is called the Oracle for Transfeminist Technologies, to imagine those alternative futures. This is another example from another collective called Surciendo, and they developed the category of digital communality. And they ask if technologies, and I put data, could be developed thinking like within the permaculture principles, that they have to be slow, small, close to your to your own life. So this idea of having technologies and data that is close to you, that is slow, that is probably not big, comes from these permacultural principles. And this is a campaign that we developed with this collective Surciendo about the eco-social impacts of technology, thinking again that there are many narratives and many imaginaries around technology that are dominant, that are hegemonic, but are imaginaries that do not allow us data to technology, but also to relate to ourselves and to our territories. And this is one of one comment from a participant of the workshop that we facilitate. And she was saying that we need an internet that moves with the rhythm of the sunflowers that are immediately connected with the environment. So this idea of decolonizing data, again, as you see, is more than just decolonizing one small entity. It's about thinking ways, alternative ways to develop the possibilities, to achieve the possibilities to achieve social justice, but also sovereignty, autonomy, and self-determination for people and for their territories. And that would be it. Thank you.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, Paola, für diesen wunderbaren Überblick und nochmal das Verdeutlichen, wie sozusagen Daten nicht einfach nur Daten sind, die wir irgendwie sortieren und qualifizieren müssen und dann schaffen wir uns damit irgendwie eine dekoloniale Zukunft, sondern dass die in sich sozusagen schon viel mehr sind und dass man da schon viel eher ansetzen muss. Wunderbar, ganz herzlichen Dank für diesen umfassenden Talk und auch nochmal sozusagen der Hinweis, dass wir heute sehr viel über sehr viel gesprochen haben und gar nicht so viel über Technologie als Technologie, aber sehr viel über Fragen von Macht, Herrschaft und Ungleichheit. Das finde ich super wichtig, auch gerade immer in Bezug mit Technologie, weil man sich ganz schnell geht mir eher ähnlich manchmal in Fragen der Umsetzbarkeit und wie können wir Technologien bauen, verwirkt. Also Paola, ganz lieben Dank für diesen wunderbaren Einblick. Ich freue mich sehr, dass du da warst. Ich hoffe, wir bleiben in Kontakt. Ich bedanke mich auch bei allen, die zugehört haben und wir sehen uns hoffentlich alle nächstes Jahr wieder, wenn die Reihe weitergeht. Es gibt auf alle Fälle nochmal eine E-Mail mit Hinweis, wann die Videos online gehen, die Mitschnitte der Veranstaltung. Ich danke allen ganz herzlich.